Just because there's a revolution, that doesn't always mean there will be revolutionary change. History is replete with examples of successful popular movements toppling repressive regimes, only to discover that on the other end, their new rulers weren't particularly different from the old. Such a feeling was doubtless shared by the poor plebeians of the early republic, who confronted conditions under the new order after the overthrow of the Tarquin dynasty, and quickly came to realize that the patrician dominance of this new government didn't actually improve their lot in life, and in many critical ways may have actually left them worse off. For despite their many faults, the Tarquins had courted the favor of the masses, utilizing the plebeians as a reliable power block against the aristocracy. But though our sources speak of the close ties between the monarchs and the plebeians, it is likely that those welcomed into the inner circle were from the wealthy plebeian families, not the poor. This dynamic has played out time and time again in many monarchies in a wide range of contexts. The quasi-meritocratic elevation of men from outside the aristocracy that monarchs feel can be trusted because they owe their entire social position to the ruling dynasty, and not a prestigious lineage. But, in addition to the opportunities the Tarquins offered to prominent plebeians, they also reined in the worst abuses by aristocrats towards citizens to further shore up support among the downtrodden. But after the establishment of the Republic, plebeians were suddenly without the protection of the Tarquins, and those who were outside the clientship networks of the elite were subject to the unrestrained rapacity and greed of Rome's aristocrats. This was typified by nexum, an extreme form of debt bondage that was resulting in the enslavement of so many freeborn citizens that there was a concern that the legions might not be able to replenish their ranks. Because only relatively well-off property owners were even permitted to serve in the legions at this time, the fact that they were falling victim to the nexum schemes of the patricians illustrates that very few were safe. In response to these and other abuses, the plebeians engaged in a sustained general strike known as the Secession of the Plebs. By withdrawing from the city and refusing to enlist in the military or engage in any work until their demands were met, the plebeians showcased remarkable solidarity, demonstrating their power and reminding the patricians that without their blood and sweat, there wasn't even a Rome at all. Fearful that the young republic's enemies would fall upon the defenseless city, the ruling class acceded to their demands, and in 494, the Tribunate was born. Though the scope of this magistracy would expand over time, the initial tribunes were still permitted a wide range of official functions. They were capable of vetoing any act by any elected official within the city limits, and were protected by a sacred religious oath that called for the death of anyone who impeded them. This was the first official capacity in which plebeians could serve, opening the door much later for wealthier members of the class to embark on public careers. Furthermore, only plebeians were eligible for this new office, and only plebeians were permitted to participate in the elections, granting the masses a degree of independence, though nothing pertaining to actual class relations or the ownership of land or capital was altered. The plebeians were content, and balance seems to have been restored by the pragmatic compromise. But every gain made by the working class provokes a reaction amongst the ruling class, as there will always be members of the elite who feel that the loss of any privilege, no matter how minute, is an egregious affront to their inalienable dignity and right to oppress. After the plebeian victory, the forces of oligarchical reaction found their voice in Gnaeus Marcius Coriolanus, a patrician war hero who had proven his bravery as a young soldier while fighting the Etruscan allies of the expelled King Tarquin, and earned his cognomen for his critical role in the capture of the Volscian town of Corioli. The early history of the Republic is filled with wars against its Italian neighbors, as Rome contended with other city-states for regional domination. Rome had achieved a level of hegemony over portions of central Italy under the Tarquins, but the overthrow of the dynasty sowed political uncertainty that invited challenges from foes seeking to pounce on the young Republic in a moment of perceived weakness. The annalistic tradition which survives presents Rome as remarkably successful in these wars, and indeed it must have been to some extent, as despite an initial weakening of its grasp on the region, the Republic did survive. But, despite its victories, these constant wars were disastrous for the class of small-holding farmers that made up the bulk of Rome's legions. Service was mandatory, and soldiers were unpaid, meaning that farms often fell into disrepair and economic devastation could await military families, even if Rome had emerged triumphant on the battlefield. This had been a driving factor behind the secession in the first place, as the soldiers became increasingly indebted to senators as they sought to maintain their holdings. These economic realities seem to have been utterly lost on Coriolanus, who counseled strongly against granting any plebeian demands in the most forceful terms. As the most outspoken proponent of the old order, he quickly earned the ire of the people, and the praise he had won for his courage and valor in military service evaporated. As the voice of the conservative aristocracy, he became one of the most hated men in Rome. His political isolation became clear during his failed campaign for the consulship. A man of his impressive lineage, with such memorable feats to his name, could expect to be elected easily, but on election day he realized that despite the strong support he received from portions of the nobility, the mass of Romans were against elevating him to high office. Plutarch records that they feared what his consulship would mean for the political rights they had so recently won through direct action and popular struggle. In addition, the Roman people saw the mass of aristocrats supporting his candidacy and became alarmed at the united front put up by the conservative faction, and so awarded their votes to his opponents. The public support of prestigious men typically was a tremendous boon to Roman candidates, so the fact that it counted against Coriolanus here is a testament to the divided political landscape and a class conflict that remained unresolved. This crushing defeat left Coriolanus a bitter man, and he seems to have been transformed from a simple ideological conservative to one that now adopted stances intentionally to provoke the poor plebeians. A confrontation between Coriolanus's reactionary faction and the popular party seemed inevitable, and when a grain shortage appeared in 491, Coriolanus's deliberately antagonistic approach would culminate in a heated dispute with the tribunes and their popular support base. To remedy the shortage, the Republic had purchased a large quantity of grain from Sicily. Rome was forced to go far afield for these vital resources, as it was still surrounded by enemies in central Italy and Etruria. After the grain arrived in the city, there was a debate over how to distribute this bounty, and Coriolanus advocated that the patricians hoard the grain until the plebeians agreed to a reversal of the settlement that had resulted in the creation of the Tribunate. He was unwilling to let the past lie, and used the crisis to push for reforms that rolled back popular gains and centralized elite control. It was the shock doctrine for the ancient world. Those who were more arrogant and more zealous for the oligarchy thought they ought to use every effort and every means to oppress the plebeians, and they advised the provisions as costly as possible to them in order that they might through necessity become more moderate. One of this oligarchic party was that Marcius, surnamed Coriolanus, who did not, like the rest, deliver his opinion with secrecy and caution, but with so much openness and boldness that many, even of the plebeians, heard him. We must pause here to reflect on the absurdity of Coriolanus's position. The grain had been purchased by the state, meaning that the contributions of the poor had been utilized in the transaction. Yet he sought to deny them the food they needed to survive, and to extract political concessions, and reduce their ability to oppose even the most absurd patrician abuses. Needless to say, the caustic Coriolanus drastically miscalculated. Rome was on the verge of a famine, and all the poor had to do was look around to see that it was the rich who were well fed and content. Coriolanus misunderstood the stakes, for the stage was already set for another revolution, and all the masses needed was a spark to light the flame. Coriolanus, through his greed and insults, was ignorant of the fact that he was on the verge of providing one. For money, honor, and tradition mean very little when men's bellies are empty and they are watching their families starve. If the Republic could not guarantee bread to the men who had fought and bled in its defense, then what use was it to them? The Republic was only 18 years old at this time, meaning it had been founded within living memory of all present. Those who have already lived through the overthrow of a government are less apprehensive than most about doing it again. The threat of open revolt led to the Senate deciding to distribute the grain for free, a victory for the plebeians, but another dent in the prestige and ego of Coriolanus. With tensions ratcheted so high, Coriolanus escalated further by speaking out vehemently against the distribution and then denying the summons of a tribune who sought an explanation. The subtext of his refusal was clear. He rejected the authority of the tribunes and their right to exist as magistrates in the state. Given his stated desire to abolish the office outright, it became clear that despite his past heroics, Coriolanus would have to be brought to heel. The authority of the tribunes rested in their sacrosanctity and the oath that all plebeians had taken to defend them and their edicts. The tribunes could not allow for the precedent to be set for any patrician, no matter his prestige, to disregard them. It was a high-stakes game of chicken, and neither side was blinking. However, despite the uncompromising approach of Coriolanus and his faction, the precariousness of the entire situation was understood by his fellow senators, and they were quick to make Coriolanus into a sacrificial lamb to sate public outrage. Coriolanus was tried for rejecting the authority of the tribunes, but because he did not believe that the people had any right to bring charges against a man so august as him, Coriolanus declined to even attend the trial. Needless to say, he was convicted and banished from the city. What Coriolanus did next would transform him from just a haughty aristocrat humbled by the plebeians, or even potentially a popular martyr for Roman conservatives, into one of the Republic's chief villains and a figure reviled by Romans of every stripe. If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support. For upon leaving the city, with several clients in tow, Coriolanus aligned himself and his band with the Volscians, the very people he had been instrumental in defeating years earlier. Granted joint command of their army, Coriolanus waged a merciless war against Rome, seizing outlying towns, enslaving residents, and putting others to death. Under these circumstances, Marcius led his forces against their cities, and taking by assault those which offered resistance to him, namely Tularium, Lavicum, Pedum, and later Bola, he made slaves of the inhabitants and plundered their property. He had taken Bola, a city not more than 12 miles away from Rome, where he got much treasure and put almost all the adults to the sword. As he approached Rome itself, Coriolanus ordered that only the farms and holdings of the plebeians be ravaged by the Volscian army. He bore such pronounced bitterness and hatred for those that had dared to assert their rights that Coriolanus conducted a horrific terror campaign against his political enemies. Rome sent out delegation after delegation in an attempt to secure a peaceful settlement to the conflict, but Coriolanus had lost all respect for friends, countrymen, Romans, and so the embassies were all turned away. Finally, the entire religious order of Rome, priests and augurs, dressed in the full majesty of their offices, traveled to the Volscian camp to remind Coriolanus of the oaths and commitments he had made before the gods of Rome, attempting to invoke the sacred order and the memory of his ancestors to bring the conflict to an end. Coriolanus again refused. This had been the final gambit of the senators, who could not imagine that any son of Rome would turn a blind eye to its gods. But the indifference of Coriolanus is illustrative of the man's true predilections and actual ideology. For while his earlier defense of aristocratic privilege had been couched in language about the sacred traditions of Rome and cloaked in a sense of unimpeachable patriotism, Coriolanus here betrays these higher principles and reveals that these had always been simply rhetorical ploys to obscure his true position within Roman class society. Like many that use these tactics, Coriolanus did not actually love his country or its religion. His loyalty wasn't to Rome, but to his place within it. As his privileges became threatened, he eagerly turned his back on the republic that he professed to love, even to the point of leading a foreign army against it. But when all hope seemed lost, Rome was saved, not through the martial strength of its legions, but by its women. For Veturia, the mother of Coriolanus, along with his wife Volumnia, his children, and the noble women of Rome, marched out in mourning garb to the Volscian camp, and begged him to cease the war, stating, "Please, before I am embraced, let me know. Have I come to an enemy or a son? Am I a mother or a captive in your camp? Have I lived so long for this, that I see you an exile, then an enemy? How wretched my old age has become! Can you truly attack the land that raised and fed you? Although you arrived with hostile intent, surely your anger departed when you crossed the border. When Rome was in sight, didn't you think, my house and home are within those walls, and so are my mother, wife, and children? I wish I hadn't given birth to you." Coriolanus was shamed into abandoning the war, perhaps finally realizing the effect that his quest for vengeance was having on those he loved. It is here that the tradition splits most sharply, and Plutarch tells us that he was killed by the Volscians for his betrayal, while according to Livy, he grew old and bitter as a permanent exile in Volsci. It's a remarkable tale, but is it actually true? Like many episodes from Roman history before the Gallic sack in 390, we are confronted by divergent traditions and narratives that elevate moral guidance over historical fact, and seem constructed so as to closely parallel Greek history, Coriolanus's life seeming to be modeled after Themistocles, the Greek commander at Salamis, who was later driven into exile and served the Persians that he helped defeat. Furthermore, despite his preference for the patricians driving every aspect of his career and leading to his eventual banishment, the family name, Marcius, is plebeian, as is that of his wife. An additional note is relevant here. We don't even know his praenomen. I have used Gnaeus, but Plutarch's tradition gives him the name Gaius. This uncertainty has allowed for some scholars to construct an alternative theory, that Gnaeus Marcius did not receive the name Coriolanus because of heroism, but because he was actually from Corioli, and not an elite Roman, but instead a powerful rural landowner whose territory straddled the Volscian and Roman border. Torn between two warring cities, this man may have decided to throw in his lot with Volsci instead of Rome, and his Roman lineage was exaggerated or even invented to make it appear that the defeats Rome suffered early in the war were inflicted not by a foreigner, but by a Roman. Such alterations in popular memory would be consistent with the alterations made in the early annalistic tradition, or at least among the sources that survived the Gallic sack and were influential on the sources we have today. It is an interesting theory, but at this point, barring the retrieval of old texts long forgotten, we cannot hope to discover the historical truth behind the tale. But in a way, it might be irrelevant, for Coriolanus has more of an impact today as an acknowledged fictional character, for he is best remembered through the Shakespearean tragedy that details how his short temper resulted in the tragic downfall of a Roman hero, and how his thirst for revenge overwhelmed his patriotism, until he was overcome by the sight of his mother, wife, and child pleading for mercy. The play is a case study in what makes and unmakes a traitor, and was given a modernist spin by the German playwright Bertolt Brecht, who interpreted Coriolanus through the lens of class struggle to depict him not as a hero fallen from grace, but as an unrepentant enemy of the people. It is in this sense, as an avatar of a myopic, self-absorbed elite intent on crushing popular movements, that whether or not Coriolanus the man actually existed, we are still confronted daily by his ghosts, wherever violence directed at the poor emerges.